The moment Blake Shelton stepped onto the view stage, he felt something was off. The crowd cheered, the lights blazed brightly, but the mood had a strange edge, like the room was holding its breath. Joy Behar sat at the table with a tight smile, her cue cards stacked neatly in front of her in a way Blake had seen before, not casual but prepared, too prepared. He settled into his seat, offering his usual friendly grin, boots planted comfortably, trying to keep the atmosphere light. But even as the music faded and cameras swung into position, Blake sensed tension buzzing under the surface, quiet but unmistakable. It wasn't going to be the easy, upbeat interview he expected. Something sharper was waiting. The conversation began harmlessly enough: tour dates, new music, jokes about country life, but it took only seconds for Joy to pivot abruptly, her tone shifting like a sudden gust of cold wind. She leaned forward and fired off a pointed question wrapped in sarcasm, challenging a comment Blake had made months earlier. The audience stiffened, sensing the hostility. Blake blinked, surprised not by the question itself but by the confrontational edge in her delivery. He responded calmly, trying to steer things back into neutral territory, but Joy pressed harder, her voice rising slightly as she cut him off mid-sentence. The ambush had begun, and Blake realized he had walked straight into it. For a few long seconds he sat still, letting her barrage continue. But he wasn't clueless. He knew what it looked like when someone tried to corner him for a reaction. Joy's tone sharpened, each question delivered like a challenge, trying to provoke, trying to rattle him into saying something that would spark headlines. Blake didn't rise to it. Instead, he studied her quietly, the corners of his mouth tightening just a bit. The audience murmured, unsure of how to react. Everyone on set felt the energy shift, the temperature rising. Blake inhaled slowly, preparing himself not for a fight but for clarity. He wasn't about to let anyone twist his words on live TV. When he finally responded, it wasn't with anger. It was with a steady, grounded tone that caught Joy completely off guard. Blake addressed the accusation directly, dismantling it piece by piece, his voice firm and unmistakably controlled. The audience reacted instantly, a ripple of surprise moving through the room as his calm confidence overpowered the tension. Joy tried to interrupt again, but Blake leaned in just slightly and continued, not loud, not aggressive, but unshakably clear. The power in the room shifted. What had started as her ambush was now becoming his moment of steady, effortless dominance. Joy attempted a recovery, tossing out another pointed question, but Blake shut it down with precision. He highlighted the misinterpretation in her framing, the lack of context, the assumptions disguised as concerns. His words weren't sharp, they were simply honest. And honesty delivered clearly had far more impact than volume ever could. The studio fell almost silent as he reminded her, politely but undeniably, that respect on a live show runs both ways. The crowd reacted with applause so sudden Joy had no chance to hide her frustration. The ambush had backfired and everyone knew it. Blake's presence grew steadier as the segment continued. Every time Joy pushed, he responded with the kind of calm confidence that came not from confrontation, but from knowing exactly who he was. He didn't match her aggression, he simply refused to let it control the room. The other hosts exchanged uneasy glances, sensing how drastically the dynamic had shifted. The audience watched in stunned silence, realizing they were witnessing a live moment unraveling into something far bigger than an awkward interview. Blake wasn't trying to win, he was simply refusing to lose himself. The producers attempted to steer the conversation back on track, but the energy had already shifted beyond repair. Joy's frustration seeped through her forced jokes and tightened smile. Blake, now fully centered, addressed her attempts to twist the narrative with unshakable clarity. The audience applauded almost every line he spoke, not because he was attacking but because he was standing his ground with truth that left no room for manipulation. Each time he spoke, the imbalance in the segment grew more obvious. Joy tried to end the tension with humor, but it fell flat. Her comments were met with awkward silence and the cameras caught every second of her strained expression. Blake remained composed, offering only brief, polite responses. His calmness wasn't passive, it was powerful, and the power shift was undeniable. Crew members exchanged glances behind the cameras, fully aware that this moment wouldn't just make headlines, it would explode across the internet within minutes. As the segment wound down, Joy attempted a final jab, but Blake didn't take the bait. Instead, he pushed back from the table, stood up calmly, and said just loud enough for the studio to hear, "I'm not staying where I'm being disrespected." The audience gasped. Joy froze, the other hosts sat stunned. Blake walked off the set not with anger, not with drama, but with the unmistakable dignity of a man who refused to be cornered by anyone. The applause erupted behind him as he exited the stage, leaving Joy staring at her cue cards with a shaken expression. Backstage, Blake felt the tension fall away like dust shaken from a coat. Crew members approached cautiously, unsure of what to say, but their expressions said enough. They knew he had handled himself with grace under fire. Blake simply nodded, offering a small smile, not boastful, not rattled, just centered. As he stepped out of the studio into the open air, he felt a calm certainty settle over him. He hadn't gone there to fight, but he also hadn't gone there to be anyone's target. And as he walked away, he carried with him the steady confidence of a man who stood firm, spoke clearly, and chose dignity over spectacle every single time. Blake took a long breath, standing fully now as the studio lights reflected off the tension carved into his expression. And he told Joy with a calmness sharper than any shout that there was a difference between interviewing someone and cornering them, a difference between conversation and confrontation, and that she had crossed that line the moment she decided his presence on the show was a chance to score points instead of have a real discussion. Which made the audience shift uncomfortably in their seats, while the producers frantically signaled from behind the cameras for someone to intervene. Yet no one moved because Blake's voice carried too much weight in the room. Even the other hosts remained frozen as he continued, saying that he had come there with respect for the show, for the audience, and even for her. But what he received in return was a staged ambush wrapped in sarcasm and hostility. The kind of setup meant to provoke headlines rather than meaningful dialogue, and he wasn't going to sit there pretending everything was normal when it clearly wasn't, especially not when millions of viewers would later be told a twisted version of the truth unless he spoke up for himself right now. Joy tried to interject again, but Blake raised a hand, not aggressively but firmly enough to make her pause, and he told her that every person deserved a fair conversation, not a combative one designed to corner them, and that if she truly believed in open dialogue, she would let people finish a sentence without twisting it into something inflammatory for the sake of a reaction, which caused the audience to murmur in agreement as Joy's expression tightened with visible frustration. Blake continued, saying that he'd spent years dealing with critics, tough interviews, and high-pressure situations, but never had he encountered a host who seemed more interested in winning than understanding, and that if the show wanted to keep its reputation as a platform for real discussion, they needed to stop treating guests like targets, because respect had to go both ways, not just flow according to who was holding the microphone. And as he stepped back from the table, the studio felt like it held its breath, everyone sensing that the moment was teetering on the edge of something irreversible, something that could only end one of two ways, either with someone backing down or with Blake walking straight out of the studio and leaving the show scrambling to pick up the pieces live on air. Blake adjusted his jacket, his patience clearly at its breaking point, and he told Joy that he wasn't there to be anyone's punching bag, especially not for a segment that was supposed to highlight his work rather than tear down his character, and the audience watched with wide, unblinking eyes as the weight of his words sank into the room. Joy attempted another forced smile, insisting that he was misreading the tone, but Blake shook his head slowly, saying that tone wasn't something you misread when it was sharp enough to cut through every answer he tried to give, and that the constant interruptions, the snide remarks, and the dismissive attitude weren't just disrespectful. They were intentional, crafted to draw him into a reaction, and he refused to play along any longer. Meanwhile, the producers frantically gestured for a commercial break, but Blake kept speaking, his voice even but uncompromising, explaining that he'd spent his entire career standing up for himself, for his values, and for the people who looked up to him, and he wasn't about to let one morning show twist who he was just to stir controversy, especially not when millions of viewers would walk away with whatever narrative the hosts decided to spin after he left. And with that, he pushed his chair back, the legs scraping loudly across the studio floor, a sound that echoed like a final warning through the silent room as everyone braced for what he was about to do next. Blake took a slow step away from the table, and the tension snapped so sharply that even the cameras seemed to hesitate, their red lights blinking like uncertain eyes. He told Joy, without raising his voice, without anger, just a firm, unwavering steadiness, that there was a difference between disagreeing with someone and trying to publicly corner them, and that today felt far more like the latter, which was exactly why he wouldn't be sitting there a moment longer pretending this was a normal interview, because it wasn't, and everyone in the room knew it. Joy tried to save her footing by joking that he was being dramatic, but the joke landed flat, swallowed by the thick silence of an audience who had long stopped seeing the moment as entertainment, and Blake simply shook his head, saying that if standing up for himself counted as dramatic, then he'd proudly be dramatic every single day rather than let someone chip away at his words and intentions. And with the producers frozen, the hosts speechless, and the show unraveling in real time, Blake tipped his hat slightly, nodded to the audience as a gesture of respect, and said that no career, no promotion, and no TV appearance was worth sacrificing self-respect. Then he turned toward the exit, each step echoing across the studio floor as the live broadcast slipped into stunned silence, leaving Joy and the entire panel staring after him, knowing they had just become part of a moment that would explode across social media within minutes. Blake reached the edge of the stage just as the producers finally snapped out of their paralysis, one of them rushing forward with a headset in one hand and panic written all over his face, whisper pleading for Blake to at least stay until the commercial break, but Blake didn't even slow down. He simply turned his head enough to say that respect wasn't something you scheduled between ad slots, It was something you gave from the moment a guest sat down, and if the show couldn't offer that, then there was nothing left for him to sit through. Behind him, Joy called out his name, once sharp and irritated like she was trying to reclaim authority. But Blake didn't respond, not because he couldn't hear her, but because he no longer felt she had earned the right to expect an answer from him after the way she'd tried to twist every word he said into a weapon. The audience remained frozen, some whispering, some filming, all aware they were witnessing something that would be replayed endlessly across the internet in a matter of hours. And the stunned silence only deepened as Blake reached the curtain, paused for the briefest moment as if deciding whether he should say one last thing, then simply muttered that people deserve better conversations than this, better honesty, better respect, better hosts, and with that final quiet verdict, he pushed through the curtain and disappeared backstage, leaving the hosts scrambling, the cameras rolling awkwardly, and Joy staring at the empty seat where Blake's calm defiance had just rewritten the entire tone of the morning show.